I'm sitting in a place where Neanderthals sat here in Gibraltar over 100,000 years ago. These were among the earliest Neanderthals to be found here in Gibraltar, and they lived here for a long time after that, as we will find in the series in places such as Gorham's Cave or Vanguard Cave. But we're not there, we're somewhere else on the rock. And it's places like these that attracted attention a long time back. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, naturalists were coming to Gibraltar, and then in the 19th century, and realized the potential that this place has had with fossils, stone tools made by people, fossil animals, all kinds of creatures that lived on the rock. Gibraltar at that time in the 19th century became one of the focal points for scientific research in the world. And then we forgot all about it. For some reason, maybe the wars, the people who were here left, others didn't take over, Gibraltar's importance was lost for a long time. And then it was regained. It was regained particularly after the Second World War, and especially in the late 1980s onwards until now. And it's from that time that the research here in Gibraltar has generated huge discoveries and the significance and importance of the place for the Neanderthals. This is what this series is going to be about. It's going to take you from the very beginning of that research to the present day, and why Gibraltar has become once again such an important place in the study not just of Neanderthals, but everything that happened, climate change and everything that happened in that part of what we call prehistory.
And today we're going to be looking at an area which is of great importance in that history. But first of all, I'd like you to imagine a period, a time in history when very little was known about deep time, in geological time. Very little was known about all sorts of issues related to evolution, and it was decades and decades before Charles Darwin, before Thomas Henry Huxley, before Charles Lyell and other people were able to come forward, put on the table different ideas about the way we now accept and interpret that type of history. And we're in a very special place for two reasons mainly. One is because the area we're in now, which contained the breccias, the Rosia breccias, were seminal in the types of debates and the way that people interpreted nature and history at the time. And two, because it's the first place in Gibraltar where we can trace that scientific work first took place in the way that we understand scientific work today. And so, for example, if we look around us here, we can see that there are deposits of what are Pleistocene breccias that contain numbers of bones, mainly mammal bones, that include, for example, bones of animals that no longer exist here in Gibraltar, that are extinct as well. So we have, for example, not just here but in other places in Gibraltar, we have the remains of elephant, we have the remains of rhinoceros, we have the remains of other animals of that period, hyena, for example, which are still extant today. We have rhinoceros and so on. Now, what's interesting about this particular area is that there were very large numbers of bones recovered from it in the 1770s, which brings us to one of the important people in Gibraltar's history related to natural history and science, which is John White. John White was brother to Gilbert White, very well known for the work he did in Selborne and the book he wrote, The Natural History of Selborne. John White was chaplain in Gibraltar and was here from 1756 to 1772 and did a lot of work on Gibraltar natural history, principally the work he did that was never published, which was Fauna Calpensis, but also he was involved in the area we are in today, which brings us back to why this area is important. He was able to look at the material that was discovered here during blasting of some of the walls here, and the large numbers of bones and so on that were collected at that time, as this whole area was revamped because a natural fall in the cliff created a hole in the fortification walls. He was able to look at those bones, and he was able also to determine that they weren't human bones. Some people had thought they maybe were human bones. They were actually mostly ruminant bones and bones belonging to goats and so on. But also importantly, it signals the first time that work of a type of a nature which was related to science from Gibraltar was published. And this was the exchange between John Boddington and William Hunter, the anatomist in London, when they were discussing the very bones from this site we're in today. That work was published in 1770 and was contributed to, albeit indirectly, by John White. So we have the beginnings of what are serious works in science emanating from Gibraltar. Some of the material from this site was also instrumental in the discussions related to diluvian and antediluvian concepts that were very prevalent at the time. And for example, people like the very famous French paleontologist Georges Cuvier and the British paleontologist William Buckland were embroiled at the time trying to determine whether or not bones were related to pre-diluvian or antediluvian processes. In other words, the flood, the biblical flood. And material from this site was used by Cuvier and also Buckland, who studied the material, and other paleontologists at the time, to try and determine the processes that were at work at the time. As I mentioned earlier, this is a period when people didn't have the same paradigm that we have today in relation to geological processes, in relation to evolution, and in relation to fossil deposition and so on. Also of interest at this site is a particular bone that was found and reported on by Forsyth Major in 1905, who was a paleontologist. He looked at some of the material that had been collected by James Smith of Jordanhill, who was a geologist that wrote about the geology of Gibraltar, discovered material from this site, as had others before him, and Forsyth Major was able to look at that material and was able to name from this site a new species of rabbit which he named Prologus calpensis, after Gibraltar Calpe. And that brings us back a little bit to the beginning, where we looked at the importance of this site. It wasn't important just at the beginning in the 1770s, but has importance all through Gibraltar's history of science, all the way up until the present time. And one of the important issues about the site as well, we may be able to see this in a reconstruction, is that a large portion of the material has been lost through scarping and removal. A large amount of material to this side has been removed over time. There would have been much, much more material 100, 150 years ago. We've now looked at the site at Rosia, which is where we've started our history of natural history and science in Gibraltar, and talked a little bit about the bones here, the fossils, and issues related to the site that are important globally. We're now going to go to another site where we're going to learn about one of Gibraltar's unique fossils and how that has changed our interpretation of evolution. We're here in Forbes Quarry, one of the magical places in Gibraltar's history of science and history of natural history. This is the place, or roundabout this area, where the Gibraltar skull was discovered. We know it was discovered before 1848, but we don't know exactly when. We know that it was presented to the Scientific Society, the Gibraltar Scientific Society, in 1848 by its secretary, Lieutenant Flint. It was kept by the Gibraltar Scientific Society until the Society's demise in 1853, and then it went to the Soldiers' Home. From there went to the Garrison Library, and from there, interestingly, it was seen by Thomas Hodgkin, who was visiting Gibraltar in conjunction with Moses Montefiore, who sent the skull to London in 1864 with a consignment of material from the Genista caves. The excavations from Genista were being undertaken by Frederick Broome, who met Thomas Hodgkin when they came to Gibraltar. So the skull goes to London and is recognised as being of importance by George Busk, the paleontologists George Busk and Hugh Falconer. They see the skull, recognise that it's similar to one that had been discovered years earlier in Feldhofer, which was the Neanderthal skull, and they realised its importance in that context. It was exhibited at the British Association exhibition that year in 1864, but before then it went to London. Charles Lyell, the geologist Charles Lyell, and Hugh Falconer took it to Charles Darwin, where he saw it. He was staying at his sister-in-law in London, and he saw it and proclaimed that Falconer brought me the wonderful Gibraltar skull. So we have the connection there with Darwin. The skull goes to London fully 5 or 6 years after publication of Origin and several years before Darwin's publication of Descent of Man. So we have that trajectory in history there with the skull. Its importance was recognised, as I said, and within that year Hugh Falconer had thought to name it as a separate species of man, but William King had already named the Neanderthal skull from Feldhofer as Homo neanderthalensis, and the difference was only a few months. Had it been a little bit sooner that the skull went over from Gibraltar to London, the name would have been different. But nonetheless, the Gibraltar skull was a more complete skull than the Neanderthal find. It had a face, whereas the Neanderthal find did not. So it allowed people that were a little bit skeptical about the importance of the Feldhofer specimen to look at another specimen that showed the same characteristics but had a lot more material to work from. So it marks a point in paleontology and in human evolution where people were able to more clearly define that we were looking at a different species of man, possibly. Whereas before that, people like Virchow, for example, were questioning what the Neanderthal skull actually was, how old it was, whether in fact it was relatively recent. A rickety Cossack, for example, he'd said that it had been inside a cave. This changed the game in relation to human evolution and how people were able to interpret the record. And in fact, in my view and in many other people's view, it forms the point at which human evolution and the study of took off. After many, many years, several decades later, the interest in the Gibraltar skull were renewed as more material came to light, and people like Arthur Keith, Sarah and so on were looking at the skull in slightly different ways. In 1864, if we go back a few decades, in 1864, after it had gone to London, Busk and Falconer saw that it was so important that they wanted to come back to Gibraltar, they wanted to come to Gibraltar and look here where we are now and in the areas surrounding for the possible matrix of the skull. They thought they'd found it, but it's not definitively clear that they had. There were areas where the skull could have come from. The matrix was similar to what the skull had, but we still don't know 100% where that skull came from. But it shows that that fossil from Gibraltar had a global importance, especially once it was recognized for what it was. And within the world of paleontology, it still remains one of the most important fossils. After the Gibraltar one was found, and there was renewed interest after that in the early part of the 20th century, people came back to Gibraltar to try and look to see whether the skull had been found, where the matrix was and so on, similar to what had happened in the 1860s when Busk and Falconer came to Gibraltar to do exactly the same thing. Busk and Falconer were able to find what they thought was the matrix of the Gibraltar one skull in the area of Forbes Quarry. Similarly, in the early 20th century, Duckworth came in 1910, Winfred Duckworth from Cambridge came in 1910 to have a look to see if he could find the matrix. And then slightly later than that, 1914, 1917 and 1919, there were visits from Henry Bruel, who was a very famous French paleontologist. He came to Gibraltar in conjunction with Willoughby Werner, who had served in Gibraltar in the Rifle Brigade and then retired to Gibraltar and did a lot of work in natural history, specifically in ornithology, but also in cave exploration. So Henry Bruel and Willoughby Werner explored the area which would lead to the discovery of a rock shelter called the Devil's Tower rock shelter, named after a tower dating to at least the early to mid 16th century, early 17th century, situated in an area which is now built up and urbanised with blocks and so on, but a tower which gave the name to the rock shelter that they found. They also found on the talus slope itself worked flint, which led Bruel to suspect that there may be the possibility of finding further human remains, further Neanderthal remains, after the Gibraltar 1 skull had been found 60 years earlier. And so Bruel wasn't able to do the excavations himself, and he then recommended that one of his students, Dorothy Garrod, who would become the first female professor at Cambridge University, he recommended her to come and do the work, and she excavated in 1925 and 1926. She discovered a further skull, which is Gibraltar 2, the second Gibraltar skull to have been discovered. This time it was the skull of a child of about 5 years old. It was in very, very solid matrix, and it took, once it was taken back to Cambridge, it took about a year to remove from the matrix. But again, in common with Gibraltar 1, it provided a lot of information relating to human evolution, where Neanderthal fitted in, and so on. So she would then go on to work at Mount Carmel in Israel and make very important findings there. So it brings into context and culminates in essence the stories we've been looking at these three sites about some of the history of science in Gibraltar and natural history, where we've had people that have come over to work here that have been eminent in their own fields of research and have worked elsewhere, but have found enough material here in Gibraltar to make discoveries and so on. And I'd like to say that that shows two main interesting concepts. The first is that Gibraltar has contributed a lot to the field of paleontology, natural history, and a whole range of disciplines as a result of having the material here, having the quality material here, having a combination of the right geography, the right geology and so on, but also because there has been a lot of contact between the people that have worked here and principally Britain at the period of the 19th century, where material that was found here was sent away to Britain, people came here to study it, and the interpretations were made in the light of a larger body of people than would have been working here in Gibraltar itself. So it's a very good example of a very early scientific network of people working here, and also with collaboration from people outside, bringing forward all sorts of information, interpretation of material and so on, that has put essentially Gibraltar on the map in paleontology and in other sciences.
I suppose that the history of Gorham's Cave goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, when people say that Captain Gorham discovered the caves. But of course, anybody who looks at these caves can see that well, they're pretty hard to miss. So how can somebody be said to have discovered Gorham's Cave? Anybody who passed by on a ship would have seen it. The reason that the cave is called after Captain Gorham is that in 1907 he explored the main cavern, sea cavern, that opens out and that we can see behind me here. And he went right to the back of the cave, and he found that almost at the end of the cave there was a gallery that went southwards. And then he decided to write his name on it. So he puts Gorham's 1907. And that's why, since then, we've referred to that cave as Gorham's Cave. And it's a series of sea caves that you can see from here. The first one is Bennett's, then we've got Gorham's Cave. The next one is Vanguard Cave. And then there's other caves that are successively lower and lower until some of them disappear under the sea. But the ones that we're really interested in are Gorham's Cave and Vanguard Caves, because they are what I like to say the most generous caves. They have given us a lot of information. After Captain Gorham discovered Gorham's Cave, and he actually did a lot of explorations in other caves in Gibraltar, but keeping to our story of Gorham's Cave, the story sort of goes very quiet. Dorothy Garrod is working in Devil's Tower in 1927, but nothing's happening in these caves. And in fact, it's only until around the time of the Second World War that somebody decided to go and explore these caves again, and Captain Alexander went down. He was from the Royal Engineers, and he was the first person to start doing some kind of, shall we say, informal excavations. Now, he didn't really have permission. There's no records of him having actually asked for permission, and in fact in 1948 the governor stops him and stops his work. And if he wrote down what he was doing and if he made any reports, they haven't survived. We have tried to source them, but they haven't survived. And some of the items that he found have been distributed across Europe. He gave things away, but most of what he excavated has disappeared. We know that he found ceramics, pottery, and that he also found bones, but that's about it. And then things go a bit quiet, but the governor decided that rather than have somebody just, doing informal excavations, he wanted to do something more formally. So there's an approach made to the British Museum. And the intention is that since Garrett had been working in Gibraltar in the 1920s, that they invited her to come out to Gibraltar again to try and see what she could find in these caves. But unfortunately, she was busy and she couldn't make it, but she recommended a colleague, Dr. John Darcy Vector, who was at the time working for the Institute of Archaeology, and he was working in Turkey, in Ankara, in Turkey. And so he came out to Gibraltar, and he came out on several occasions in the 1950s, and he did a succession of excavations, and a lot of the first information that we get that's been done formally and in a systematic scientific way comes from Vector. Now, Vector's techniques were very different from the techniques we employ nowadays, but some of the ceramics and the bones that he found are in the Gibraltar Museum, and some of them are still in museums in the United Kingdom. For example, in the Ashmolean Museum, there are some collections there. Then after that, after Vector, the funding for Vector ran out and he stops his work, things start going quiet again. There's a little bit of dabbling here and there by amateur archaeologists, but it goes very quiet. In the 1960s, George Palau did come into the cave and explored it, and he reported having seen a signature somewhere on the cave dated 1943. And the initials are J.J. Davies, but we don't know who that was or what he was doing there. Certainly there's no reports from that excavation or anything like that. And after George Palau, things go quiet again until the late 1980s. At that time, the British Museum made an approach to Gibraltar, to the Gibraltar Tourist Board, and Dr. Jill Cook and Chris Stringer, who is now currently in the Natural History Museum in London, came out to try and investigate the possibility of carrying out archaeological digs in Gorham's cave. Clive and I at the time had no knowledge of archaeology. Our involvement with Gorham's cave was that we were doing research on birds that use the cave as a roost in the winter. They're the crag martins. But because we were familiar with the caves, we agreed that we'd go down there and we'd show them around and discuss the possibility of working down in the caves. And that really was the beginning of the story of the involvement of the Gibraltar Museum with the excavations. That's where it all started. And in the 1990s, we started the current phase, what is now known as the Gibraltar Caves Project. The work that we've started in Gorham's Cave and then in Vanguard Cave that has allowed us to take out the information that these caves are so generously giving to us, and that we then take out to interpret it and understand the world that the Neanderthals were living in.